Our sponsor today is GLSA. For those non-members who may be dropping in on the call today, GLSA, or Group Legal Services Association, is an association and an affiliate of the American Bar Association, professional membership representing the legal services plan industry and provider attorneys. And joining GLSA is just a good way for solos and small firms to increase their business. Check us out at glsaonline.org. This month's presentation is it's a little different, and it's really cool because we're actually broadcasting live out of New Orleans at our conference this year. My name is Tom Martin. I'll be your host today. Our first CLE today is Presenting Cultural Competency for Attorneys, the NOLA Gumbo pot example with Amy Yacorzynski. And I'm very excited to introduce you to her. She's today's guest speaker, and she'll be telling us a bit more about that. She's been practicing law since 2010, and she's a California native. She attended Villanova University School of Law. She relocated to New Orleans, and she's now working in criminal defense. 3 fun facts about Amy are that, number one, which is really cool, she just recently appeared as a contestant on Jeopardy, and the episode aired on March 15th, so you should check that out if you can. Number two is that she has a working jukebox in her living room, and I'd love to hear what her playlist is on that. And that she recently finished work on a local musical as a props designer. And I'd love to learn more about that too. But without further ado, I'll let you take it away, Amy, and tell us a little bit more about your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. First of all, I want to make sure that y'all can hear me okay. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. So thank you so much for that introduction, Tom. I really appreciate it. This will be my first time speaking, and so I'm a bit nervous, and it's very interesting because I can't see most of the audience in the room. We have just a few attorneys who I'm very glad to see, but the majority of you all, I assume, are teleconferencing in, so welcome as well. And it's pretty funny and sort of ironic that those 3 interesting facts, none of them relate to my practice of law, but there you go. I guess that's just maybe proof that I'm a little more multifaceted. So today's presentation, like Tom mentioned, is going to be regarding cultural competency, and the example is sort of the gumbo pot example. What that really, what I wanted to emphasize, especially because this conference is here in New Orleans, is the idea of a cultural gumbo, a culturally really rich city like this with a ton of history, where right now we're celebrating our tricentennial year. And there's just so many different cultures, from indigenous people to immigrant cultures to people of differing backgrounds, religions, the Mardi Gras culture, all sorts of different people, and how we all really interconnect, and really what appreciating other cultures can do for you in your law practice, especially in the context, I'm a solo practitioner, so how you can really distinguish yourself and be an individual in your solo practice, and how really being an individual and being authentically individual can also really help you relate better to your clients and help be the best advocate that you can for those individuals. So I guess without any further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. And Tom will be moderating the online comments or questions. And if anyone has any questions in the room, I'd love to stop and take a moment to talk about them. And if not, I believe there'll be time at the end for some questions. So this sort of was designed to be a little bit of a primer also on New Orleans, especially for those of you who are attending the conference here and are not from here or haven't been a visitor to New Orleans in the past, or if you all are still teleconferencing in but are planning to join us later in the weekend. So cultural competency. Basically, cultural competency is really having an understanding to be able to understand practices other than yours, have ideas, be able to accept ideas that are different from your own. I think especially us as attorneys, a lot of times we have, because of our legal training, because of everything that we've learned throughout law school and throughout our experiences as attorneys, we can be a little bit set in our ways. We can be a little bit rigid and regimented about the way we think about things, that we think about things in terms of black or white. We think about things in terms of, is this a good, legal argument or not, without really contextualizing those facts and that information, and really identifying inherent biases within yourself when it comes to other people, people who might be different than you, from a different ethnic background, a different socioeconomic background from you. Maybe there's a language barrier, and really being able to kind of start to really recognize those biases and be able to break them down. Also, like I touched on in the intro to this presentation, really being authentically yourself and fostering genuine relationships with other people, because you're more now open and authentic, and really leading from a place of like a sense of true identity. And so that's sort of what I'm going to be focusing on today. Basically, Merriam-Webster defines culture as beliefs, social forms, material traits of a racial, religious, or social group, and also the characteristic features of everyday existence. So what your culture could be is a lifestyle. For those of y'all who are in the room with me, you can see that I have tattoos and I have alternative looking hair. So I'm part of sort of alternative culture. I'm part of tattoo culture. I have, I have embraced this aspect of this particular lifestyle and adopted it as a somewhat of a cultural touchstone. So that can also be culture too. And again, being an attorney, being able to really see and accept other people and accept where they're coming from, and being able to meet them where they are, is what I want to focus on today. So like I said in my intro, we're celebrating right now our tricentennial year. New Orleans happens to share a birthday with me. I'm slightly younger than 300, but New Orleans will be turning 300 on May the 7th. And that was the date that the city was founded, when it was founded by French settlers who were sent into this territory and into this region. And so it's pretty remarkable that you all are here for this conference during this time. There's a lot of awesome cultural events that are going on. We have the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival that's kicking off on Friday, which is amazing. It's just a day full of amazing stages. I think there's maybe more than a dozen different stages and venues within the festival where you can see music, where you can experience food, where you can experience one-on-one interviews with local artisans and culture bearers and musicians. So it's really awesome, and that will also sort of give you a really nice taste of what our culture really encompasses here and why it is such a gumbo. So that's basically where we are. New Orleans culture, what is it? What kind of distinct communities exist here? New Orleans, the reason that I've used gumbo as an example is you hear all the time about the melting pot, that our country is a melting pot, that we're full of different flavors. The gumbo, there's a New Orleans food historian, Jessica Harris, who said the difference is that in a gumbo, there isn't a melting. There's still, you can taste each distinct flavor, but it comes together to make something really beautiful, really interesting, completely unique, steeped in tradition, but still fresh at the same time. And that's me paraphrasing, but y'all can read the quote for yourselves. But certainly that is really what I want to bring today for you all to get a glimpse of it, for those of you all who are visitors here, but also just how that kind of appreciation for other cultures, whether again it be someone's racial or ethnic makeup, whether it be someone's religion, any aspect of someone else's culture, that really, it doesn't have to melt into a melting pot. It can be a distinct flavor. And those kinds of appreciations that you have in your practice can really help advance your practice, set you apart amongst your peers, and be able to be a more effective advocate. So New Orleans. So New Orleans was founded in 1718. I think I already mentioned that. That's why we're coming up on our 300th year. And everywhere you'll see, for those of you who are in the room with me, you'll see that there are flags everywhere that say tricentennial, because we're really rapidly approaching it. There's all sorts of awesome festivities going on that really touch on that history. So of course, like everywhere in the Americas, this was an area that was inhabited by Native Americans before the French settlers came in, and the French settlers came in 1718. Of course, then the city was founded, quote unquote, by the French settlers in 1718, and then eventually was ceded over to Spain. So there are French influences here that date all the way back to the 1700s, and there are Spanish influences in the French Quarter. Ironically, most of the buildings are actually Spanish. And if you've ever been to San Juan, Puerto Rico, or Havana, Cuba, you'll see a lot of that same architecture that you see in Old San Juan that you'll see in the French Quarter, because it's French style. Spanish style architecture. So don't let the name French Quarter fool you. Of course, then the French regained control for about a year, only to then sell it in the Louisiana Purchase to the United States, and that's when it became a U.S. state shortly thereafter. So in New Orleans, well, 1803 was the purchase. I believe 1812 was the year that it became a state. And so then, once it was an American territory, because of our access to the port, all of a sudden, in addition to having those French and Spanish heritage backgrounds, in addition to now having some American white settler backgrounds, this city also had a rapid incumbence of an influx of individuals that were coming from all over Europe. And so by 1840, this city was actually bigger, one of the biggest port cities. It was bigger than Baltimore. It was really a real jewel of the South. Obviously, our positioning by the Mississippi River was a huge draw for people of all cultures that were fishermen, that were in shipping, that were really looking for opportunity and found it in New Orleans. And because of that, we have really amazing, interesting blends of cultural identity here. In the French Quarter, at one time, there was such an influx of Italian immigrants that they wanted to rename it the Sicilian Quarter. And so that really kind of goes to show the evolution and the adding to the mixture that every different component brought to the city. And so that's sort of an overview of the history of New Orleans. So just starting from that point of different, the blending of different cultures. Of course, we can't, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about how New Orleans was the center of the slave trade. There were so many individuals brought over here against their will, and this was a major destination for those who were enslaving individuals. And of course, ultimately, that became a huge additional addition, I don't want to say additional addition, but another addition to this gumbo and to the rich sort of folk traditions in Louisiana.
If you all have even ever seen the television show Treme, you might be familiar with the concept of Mardi Gras Indians. And this is a great example of how the cultures borrowed from one another, how the cultures really drew inspiration from each other and really lived in a way that was harmonious. There's a really interesting quote, it's up on the screen, hopefully you all can see it as well, that really the tradition of Mardi Gras Indian masking on Mardi Gras Day and also on St. Joseph's Day here in New Orleans really stemmed from sort of a mutual appreciation between people in New Orleans, Black people in New Orleans, and also the Native Americans who at different times in their history were helpful, and they were helpful for fugitive slaves in this state. And there's really a mutual appreciation of those cultures. And so that's just one example that's really specific to New Orleans, very traditional, that really goes to show how these cultures can blend and really create something that's very unique, is a reflection of both cultures, and is really true to each culture. You're not losing anything. Another example would be intersectional food. There's a fairly significant Vietnamese population of individuals who came from Vietnam and settled in New Orleans. Part of that is because this is a Francophone city. And so because there were individuals that were French speaking, there was some level of camaraderie here. There also were a lot of fishermen that knew that they would be able to become successful fishermen here in New Orleans and in the surrounding regions. So we recently had a restaurant that opened that essentially uses Vietnamese style to make crawfish, which of course is a local food. And so again, that intersectionality comes from, this is now this is something that was a Louisiana traditional folk kind of cultural food that now has been infused with the flavors of a different culture and has really created something new and interesting. And it's a new place called Boyle Seafood House. It just opened maybe a month or a month and a half ago. And just another example of how those intersecting cultures can really bring about some new growth and something new and interesting. And also these kinds of cultural displays, right now they've created a secondary culture that's really steeped in admiration for two different types of cultures. Of course, the biggest export out of New Orleans is our music. You know, jazz was created right here in this city. Again, we have Jazz and Heritage Festival coming up starting on Friday. And then, of course, you had the era of R&B music, you know, amazing songwriters like Alan Toussaint, producers like Cosimo Matassa, who is an Italian-American who was living in the French Quarter, and he produced all these great R&B records that you heard, whether it be the Meters or Alan Toussaint or Ernie Cato, all these sort of 1960s R&B type of groups. He produced all those in a small little storefront in the French Quarter, and that place still exists today. And again, you know, that's another aspect of those different cultures really meeting together. Of course, hip hop and bounce really being now sort of the modern musical export of New Orleans, especially with the rise of bounce artists like Big Frida, who's a great example, has been featured on Drake, Beyonce, a lot of really mainstream pop culture acts. And Big Frida is a queer person of color from New Orleans. So it's very interesting that, again, it's really bringing all these different cultural facets. Second line culture. I think this is really where it gets into cultural competency on a little bit more of a personal way. Is second line culture really brings music out of the bars, out of the music venues, and into the streets, into the neighborhoods. It's more democratic. It gives everybody access to music and to fun and to culture. Let's see. Yes. So second lines are a really great example of bringing music to neighborhoods. I'm going to see if this clip will play. Hopefully it will. But basically bringing music out of bars into streets, and it's really, like I said, sort of a democratizing force for everybody. Anybody can walk up and join the second line. If it passes by your house, or if you choose to go down where you know it's going to pass, it stops along at neighborhood bars along the way, and people just join the parade. It's essentially a parade for everybody. And the really cool thing about that is that it really crosses all cultures, all socioeconomic bounds. You know, the social aid and pleasure clubs that put on these second lines are really not people who are in the high society. They're not people that have access to the grandiose Mardi Gras pageantry of some of the more regal or more regally perceived Mardi Gras crews. And so these are really ways for just everyday folk with everyday jobs to really be able to connect with each other and with their neighborhood. So let's see if this plays. Maybe. If it doesn't, then no. Well, maybe. So even without hearing the music, but it is brass band music, I mean, you can see people are just out in the streets dancing. And one of the things that I thought was really cool about this one was that this guy is just totally by himself, cutting loose, and then you'll see some other people starting to join and dance as they're just, you know, starting to walk along the route. And this is basically just walking through everyday neighborhoods, just people of all different cultures, blending, hanging out with each other. Two dudes dancing with each other in the street. This is, you know, a perfect example of, I think, how you can really embrace cultural differences. And let me close this before it just starts playing a whole bunch of second line music. Really embrace cultural differences, really embrace, you know, your neighbor, you know, people that you may not know, but that, you know, you still have something in common with because you love the music or you love the culture. You know, Mardi Gras culture. Let's see if I can make this. So Mardi Gras and parades. This is a picture of the Zulu parade that happens on Mardi Gras Day. But again, with the different types of parades. So, you know, second line is much more informal. It's in the streets. Everybody can join in and have a good time. Then you have parades where it is more formal and people can join because they share, you know, there's some parades that are for all women. There are some parades that are for different ethnic groups to celebrate their heritage. You have the Italian and Irish parades, which both just happened last month, because on St. Patrick's Day and then St. Joseph's Day is when the Italian-American parade takes place. And you also have even an Irish-Italian hybrid parade, because they fall typically on the same weekend, and because there are so many people that have both of those backgrounds, especially because they came in that sort of 19th century wave of people who were settling in New Orleans. Isleño culture, which are Spanish people from the Canary Islands. We have a huge population just outside of the city in St. Bernard Parish of Isleño people, and they really hold on to those traditional Spanish cultural traditions. They wear really traditional sort of folk garments at the festivals, and it's awesome to see. And so there's a real sense of, but it's really an ability for everyone to come and participate in all of these different cultures and get a little slice of how everything, how they fit into this larger New Orleans gumbo. Of course, the LGBTQ community here is, especially being in the South, this is one of the major, I would say, epicenters. We have a couple of awesome festivals, including Southern Decadence, that happens in the fall. And just again, that there's a real sense here that this is a contribution to our city. Like I mentioned before, Big Frida being a really sort of pop culture icon now that has come out of New Orleans, and again is a queer person of color from New Orleans, doing hip hop, doing bounce music, really unapologetic about being a queer person, and it's just awesome and cool. So, and what really makes all that is people who are living their authentic selves, people who are saying, this is me, I came here because, either I'm from New Orleans, or my family came to New Orleans, or someone like me who's transplant. I'm from Los Angeles originally. I went to law school on the East Coast. I came to New Orleans and really found my place here almost instantly. And this is a story that you'll hear over and over from people who have transplanted here, is essentially you come here because all of a sudden you feel like, oh, okay, I'm me now. I can be me. I've found my place. There's really something for everyone. I can participate in all these amazing cultural opportunities. I can go to these amazing music festivals. I can also go to amazing cultural festivals. I can see Mardi Gras parades. I can see parades on my doorstep if I want to. And that's really, the joie de vivre of what the city is about, and why people come here, to really be able to live authentically and not just fitting in somewhere, but truly feeling like you have a place or you belong. And that others in this city have a true interest and true appreciation here. Most people know that this is a foodie city. There are people, like I gave the example of the Vietnamese crawfish boil place, and there are people that have, boiled the crawfish the same way that their dad and their dad's dad and their granddad before that have always taught them, that are going to go check it out, because there's a real appreciation for any kind of cool innovation and other and cultural contributions to this culture. So all this is a great primer, but what does that have to do with me being a lawyer? Why do attorneys need to be culturally confident? We will meet our clients' needs better if we can come and meet them where they are and understand those needs. And sometimes when your client is telling you what they think they need, that may be accurate, but it's part of our job to investigate what's really going on, what is at the heart of the matter. We can be better allies when we see our clients in a more authentic way, and we can help our clients avoid pitfalls or mistakes if we know that they may be coming from a difference in culture where they're not as familiar with the legal system as we are, where they're not as comfortable in a courtroom as we are, or in an arbitration as we are. We're going to be able to help guide our clients if we can understand where they're coming from culturally, what their experience has been in the legal field. We're going to be able to be more effective as lawyers. So Professor Sue Bryant, there's a really amazing, awesome work called The 5 Habits, Building Cross-Cultural Competence in Lawyers. Basically, there's 5 habits that she touches on. The first habit is to identify similarities and differences. So when your client comes through the door, being able to relate is very important. So if you're able to find a common ground to start from, that's always the great first step, but also to be realistic about differences. to not gloss over the fact that you're coming from perhaps a different socioeconomic background, or a different ethnic background, or a different religious tradition, or a difference in a language barrier. So identifying similarities and differences. The second would be considering the 3 rings. So there are 3, Professor Bryant essentially says there are 3 rings that you're operating from at all times. Your relationship to your client, the client's relationship to whomever the decision maker is, whether that's a judge, whether you're going to be going to a jury trial, sort of understanding who the decision maker is, from that decision maker back to you, the attorney, as well as that decision maker back to your client. So how those all interplay with each other, really considering how your client is going to be perceived by a judge or other decision maker, how you're going to be perceived by a judge or other decision maker. Again, I know that going into a courtroom, I'm going to have to alter my appearance a little bit from the way I normally look. I'm not going to maybe have visible tattoos. My hair may not be blue that day. I'm going to find a way to make sure, because I know if I'm in front of a more conservative judge, or certainly if I'm in front of a jury, that I need to be able to have them meet me where I am instead of having a predisposition because of their initial appreciation of what I look like. And you've got to be able to obviously do that with your clients as well. And the only way you can do that is by first, obviously, understanding similarities and differences. Number 3 would be considering parallel universes. What that really means is, in a parallel universe, what would have caused my client to behave this way, or what would cause my client to have anxiety about this proceeding? Sometimes it's what we might consider a very benign proceeding. I work a lot in criminal defense, and even on just a routine, pretrial conference date, or, in the civil world, you may have a settlement conference date. Your client may see that as really, really high stakes because they have some fear or trepidation about the legal process. And you have to consider that in their parallel universe, because where they're coming from is not a place of comfort with the legal system or court proceedings like we are. They're not coming from that place of comfort. They may have never experienced a courtroom outside of what they've seen on television, or what they've heard from someone else who maybe had a negative experience. So if your client is maybe having some fear, having some trepidation, or otherwise acting or reacting in a way that may not make sense to you, if you have an appreciation of where they're coming from culturally, whether, again, that be from a socioeconomic background or a cultural, any sort of cultural background that may have influenced why they might be reacting in a way that doesn't make sense to you, the lawyer, and being able to identify that. Avoiding pitfalls. So again, this kind of goes back to making sure that your client is aware of the processes, making sure that your client is understanding what their level of involvement is and what your role is, as well as who the decision maker is. So avoiding those pitfalls by just, again, knowing where your client is culturally, being able to adapt and really meet someone where they are. And then examining and eliminating bias. Professor Bryant talks about this as, of course, a lifelong exercise for everyone to be able to eliminate your own inherent biases. And my belief is that comes from just over and over being open to all sorts of different types of people, and being able to authentically express who you are and receive information as well. And so I'll touch on that next. Why I think New Orleans leads by example in these facets is relating to each other. Like I've mentioned before, we really identify our similarities when it comes to our cuisine. Adding elements of different cultures along the way is a great example of that. When it comes to our music, adding elements of different musical styles along the way, African rhythms that brought about the birth of jazz. You had traditional brass music that was then livened up by African rhythms and became a whole new style of music that's a uniquely American export. So we relate to each other by finding similarities and bringing together, different components. We also love explaining our differences. People are very open with their culture here. The city feels like it gives you permission to be more open and expressive, and that really comes through with even my examples of the different types of heritage parades where you have second lines, but you also have specific Irish, Italian. You have the Zulu parade during Mardi Gras that's really a celebration of Black culture in the city. So all of those different, explaining our differences in a way that's really accessible for other people to experience. And dismantling biases. Our city's sort of set up in a way where we're really geographically close. Everyone's house is pretty close to each other. If you have, any yard at all, you're kind of a big deal in New Orleans. Everybody's home is very close to each other. If you all get an opportunity to take a walking tour of the Garden District or any neighborhood really in New Orleans, you'll see that, we really kind of need to interact because we're all very close to one another, and we're also geographically isolated because we're pretty much surrounded by water on almost every side. We're almost like an island here. So we have the unique privilege of really sort of converting that into these awesome hybrid cultures where you have Mardi Gras Indians, where you have blended fusion cuisines, where you have blended fusion music, where you have things like Irish Italian parades, or all kinds of different things that are just fusions and blends, because frankly we all are just so close to one another, and so that's why I think New Orleans leads by example. And so what I'd like to, I guess where I was going with all of this is what we can do as lawyers to become more culturally inclusive really has to do with, I think, taking what this city has to offer and internalizing that a little bit about being okay with the idea that people are different and have unique cultures, but making them accessible for other people to experience or understand or enjoy. Asking questions instead of making assumptions. Here you'll always see, locals will be very open with you, but also pretty inquisitive about where you're from and what you're like and what you like to do, especially if you ask for recommendations. People are going to ask you, what kind of food do you want? You want seafood? You want Creole? Do you want Cajun? You want Vietnamese? Honduran? What kind of food do you want? Because people want to see what your preferences are, and they're going to ask you questions. And so I think having that kind of mindset of openness and being able to receive information, but also really living authentically, not trying to fit in, but finding a way for you to belong. The idea of having deliberate authenticity. So there's an excellent book that is right here called The Authenticity Principle. And it really talks about how you can, because I'm moving around too much. Hello, am I there? So it talks about how you can be, how you're being your authentic self is a way to be more receptive and more culturally competent in your relationship with other people. So there's 7, so what the author Ritu Basin has to say is there's 7 behavioral dimensions. When you choose to express or withhold emotion would be one of them. So when you decide whether you want to be stoic or impassioned. Nonverbal communication, obviously we all know this could be body language, this can be looks, this can be, a roll of the eye, or, crossing your arms across your chest to indicate that you don't want to interact, or to be like me with your arms flailing everywhere and walking around and basically begging someone to approach you and talk to you. The words that we use, with some people can relate to this idea of code switching, of being able to speak one way among your friends and a different way among peers, colleagues, judges, people who, versus just casual conversation at home. This is especially true for people who have an immigrant background, people who are children of immigrants and maybe speak a different language at home than they do when they're out interacting in public in their everyday life. And so that term is typically encompassed in the idea of code switching. How we speak also, the inflection, the accent, the tone. I can tell you that when I'm not when I'm not speaking at a conference, I probably would be speaking a little bit differently, although using my hands just as much. I'd probably have a little bit of a lower tone, a little bit maybe less upbeat. And so those are the kinds of decisions about, am I being authentic, or am I being am I adapting to the situation, or am I flat out just being somebody that I'm not? Appearance.
So whether you choose to be, whether you're choosing like myself to have tattoos or some other alternative look, or whether you're choosing to dress more conservatively, or whether you're choosing appearance based on maybe a religious mandate, all those things really relate to, again, how authentic you're being in any given situation. Content of your conversation, whether you're open, whether you're closed off, whether you're being forthcoming or being a little guarded. And then our actions. What are we choosing to say yes to? What are we choosing to turn down? Those are the 7 behavioral dimensions that Ritu talks about in her book, about how to live and be authentic in what you're in your everyday life, but also in your professional life. And she really emphasizes, even if you can't be authentic all the time, at least show some aspect of your personality, some aspect of you in a way that's adapting to the situation. So again, as I pointed out earlier, I sort of can't, I've just chosen to present myself in a way that's a little bit more alternative looking. I have the tattoos, I have the blue hair, but in a situation that calls for it, I will wear a blazer, I'll cover up, I'll wear, a hose or pants or a suit. I'll do something differently with my hair, whether that's coloring it to its natural state, or styling it in a way that's a little more conservative, because that's an adaptation that I need to make. But whenever possible, I'm going to be as certainly presentable as I possibly can, but authentic in the way that I, my true self. And why I choose to do that, and why I think it's beneficial to do that, is it makes you as a person seem like a person, especially when we're interacting with clients, when they come to your office. A client who may not have a whole lot of experience in the legal field, a client who maybe has never been in a courtroom before, never interacted with an attorney before, to see you as a regular person, even if you're a regular person still wearing a suit, you're a regular person because you're a little more open. You're a little more willing to, again, practice those 5 habits and immediately identify a similarity, identify something where you meet someone where they are. That is going to really foster some trust, really foster an ability to have genuine interaction. And identifying cultural difference ensures that we're representing our clients the way that they see themselves, right? We're not going to cast our client in a role that they don't see themselves in. Now, sometimes, obviously, we all know that sometimes this may be incongruous with what we need to do as legal advocates, but whenever possible, really trying to make sure that if we understand where our client is coming from, especially if that may have informed their choices. Again, I mostly practice criminal defense, and sometimes that does come into play, where someone's language barrier or someone's prior cultural understandings have informed their choices that ultimately led them to be in a criminal court, or may have led them to be in some other legal situation. And so being able to really understand that can be a valuable asset in being able to adequately and effectively represent your client. Additionally, understanding where they're at culturally, just like I talked about, knowing how to adapt my authentic self in a way that is packaged professionally and able to be presentable to a decision maker. Same thing for you and your client. Once you understand where your client's coming from, it's a whole lot easier to be able to ensure that your client is providing their best face forward to that decision maker, to make sure that that decision maker has an informed understanding of where your client is coming from, but also is that your client's being able to adapt to the situation. And of course, I think this is somewhat important. It's certainly important here in New Orleans because we are a small community. When you present yourself as a more open and authentic person who really strives for cultural awareness for other people, it's going to come across in all facets, whether it be with decision makers like judges, whether it's with colleagues or even opponents. There is a real sense when you're more approachable that other people are going to want to work with you. Other people are going to want to make referrals. Other people are going to want to interact with an attorney like you. And I think that that's really, the kind of openness that this city embodies, and that I hope that you all who are here in the room get to experience, is something that can really be carried over with you, even in small doses in some way into your practice, where now you're able to really be more open and receptive to something that you may not know too much about, be comfortable asking questions about differences, and also be able to really strive to at least make one identification of something that you can relate to somebody about. In that initial client meeting, to be able to initially start off, on a high note by identifying some similarities and just being attuned to what other people are bringing to the table, is going to really create so much more trust, instill a whole lot more confidence between your client and yourself. And it also really sets the tone that even though you are that you may have the experience in this field, that this really is a collaborative effort. And you do, because we all know we do need our clients' help. We can't do it without the information that only they know. We can't do it without the kind of vital information that we need to get from our clients. And sometimes it can be hard to get information out of your clients because you're not meeting them in a place where they really understand that you're their advocate and not an adversary, or not not someone who's there to really steer the ship without them. So I hope I think that is actually the last slide. So hopefully that is a good overview for you all. And thank you so much for bearing with me, and especially for y'all that are on the tech side of things and are experiencing this as a podcast or as an online chat. I know it was a little bit of a bumpy road, so I apologize. And thank y'all for your time. Try not to breathe into the microphone. I think that's. Well, actually, so when I was on Jeopardy, it was long and dark and very like chestnut brown. It was my natural color, and then I recently cut it. It was very long, and I cut it and donated it. And once I cut it, I thought, well, Jazz Fest is coming up. I'm gonna have some fun and color it, and then I'll just color it.
For those of you on the line, we'll be holding for just a minute while Amy takes some questions here.
Yeah, it aired about a month ago.
We had some technical difficulties earlier, so we only have one mic, unfortunately.
I was in the lead until Final Jeopardy, and I the champion remained the champion. And it was a heartbreaker. It was tough, but it was okay because he's just as sort of detached and stoic as you see on television. Pretty much the extent of what you see with the interaction between contestants is really all there is. You don't get a whole lot of additional face time with him. And I think he's a nice guy, but he certainly is he's there to produce the show. Yes.
Do they give you a sense of the topics that you're going to be quizzed on?
Yeah, a lot of people have that misconception, and I wish that were true, because then you could just study for it like the bar, and then you'd know what's on it, and then you'd pass. But no, it's not like that, unfortunately. Some people have longer than others because you might be told months in advance that you're going to be on such and such a day. I auditioned in November. I got a call back a week later, and I was back in the studio in December. So I basically had like 3 weeks to prepare. I was also running a political campaign at that time. So I really didn't have much time to study, but I did touch up on some aspects that I thought I was lacking in. And of course, not one thing that I studied was a clue on the show. And something that I obviously now wish that I would have studied was all of the Eastern European countries that touch the Danube, because that was the question. So no, basically, if you want to be on Jeopardy, and if you ever get the call, pick up the most recent almanac and just try to read as much as you possibly can with that tiny type. It's like, 10,000 pages. Pardon? Well, everyone is trying at the same time. And so because everyone's... But you just can't get in there. I experienced that too, and if you all, I don't know if anyone's a regular watcher, but you'll see people just grimacing and they're so frustrated. That's a real reaction. You would have seen me making some of those same faces of just absolute, just complete frustration because you know the response and you can't get in. But I think that that's kind of really a testament to the fact that all three contestants are pretty evenly matched almost all the time, and so everybody knows the answer, and it's just who's the quickest on the draw. And it's not automated in any way. There's just literally a assistant producer that's off to the side that flips a switch when the lines are open for you to be able to buzz in. So there's no rhyme or reason to it. You sort of have to get into like a Zen rhythm with that person and think about when they're flipping the switch. So none of it is very scientific, but that's amazing.
That's a good non-Jeopardy question. So you've identified who your real self is, and like I'm assuming
somewhat.
You're showing us a version of
Sure.
your real self. How often do you take that and use it to your benefit in marketing your law practice? Like, would you say, hey, I can relate to you because I have tattoos, or I have colored hair, or I like red dresses, or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you go about doing that?
I personally haven't done a whole lot of that, and part of that is because where I'm at in the stage of my life right now, I have a child who's not yet school age. She will be in the fall. So I've somewhat scaled back a little bit the marketing aspect. I'm happy with the clients that I currently have. But I have been told, and I know that this is something that I can harness and could choose to harness. I will also say that I've had many, many tattoo artists who have been my clients because they either know, or someone that they know, or they may have tattooed me themselves, or know someone, or either way, when they know that they need a lawyer, they think, well, this is someone who looks like me. This is someone who I can relate to right off the bat. I'm also someone who would be happy to meet you at, your at a coffee shop or a bar or wherever, or your tattoo shop. So I've had that too, where I've had clients who maybe worked in a bar or restaurant that I've met them there to do an initial, sort of client intake or just an initial discussion. And so that is definitely something that I think if you can really identify, and Vidhu's book is awesome for this because she sort of has exercises built in. It's a pretty short book about how to really identify, which of those aspects are the most important for you to express. Like out of those 7 behavioral aspects, certainly the one that's most important to me is appearance. I want to look the way that I look. I find it to be sort of integral to self-expression. And some people may be different about that. Some people may be more attuned to either their emotional side or a religious practice or whatever that may be. But I think identifying that, you can really harness that, especially in this sort of solo realm, to distinguish yourself. And I certainly plan to when I do more advertising, when I'm at a place where I want to do that. I think that that's it's an awesome way to distinguish yourself and be more relatable to clients. So I think if there's an aspect that that you really set yourself apart in, it's amazing.
Well, it seems to me like when you're a solo, your firm's brand, your firm's image is essentially a reflection of yourself.
You personally, right?
You may have 1 or 2 support staff that help move it one way or another. You may have a separate online image,
right.
But
and that's why I think
exactly.
That's why I think it's so important as a solo to be able to identify, who am I and how will people perceive me when they walk into my office? Because that's it, you're it. You and maybe your assistant or your receptionist or whoever are the only face-to-face interactions that you're going to get. And so, for me, that's part of the reason why it's important for me to always pretty much look like the way I really look in real life. There have been on Jeopardy, I had my tattoos showing. My hair was normal at the time, but I wanted to look like I really look, and that was important to me. And I think it's important. Obviously, it's easy for me because of the way I look to have an instant conversation starter and a way to relate to someone right off the bat. But not everyone's comfortable with that, and a lot of people really are just someone who dresses conservatively, and that's fine. That's who you are as a person. But if if you're really into, whatever, the Baltimore Orioles, like have a bunch of memorabilia everywhere, and be able to relate to someone about that. If there's a thing that you're really passionate about, I think being able to do, especially as a solo, being able to really be the person who is wide open about that is, I think, really an asset that you can use to distinguish yourself.
Cool.
Thank you all so much for your time. This is my first time ever presenting.
Thank
So
you,
I really
Amy.
appreciate y'all's patience. And please enjoy your time here.
Perfect. All right, for everyone listening, I want to thank Amy again for sharing her time and thoughts. Thank you, Amy, for being my guest today. And thank you all for attending our CLE, first for today and for the conference, presenting cultural competency for attorneys, the NOLA Gumbo pod example with Amy Yacorzynski.